The midnight filly's eyes rolled white with fear, hooves striking dust in agitated bursts. Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the corral, her breath slow and measured, despite the animal's nervous circling. They mirrored each other in ways neither would acknowledge wary, watchful wounds hidden beneath composed exteriors. "Easy there, Shadow," she murmured. "No need for all this fuss." Her fingers brushed unconsciously against her ribs, where the bone had never quite healed right, an old reminder that throbbed in cold weather. The filly snorted, tossing her head, maintaining distance while watching Eleanor's every movement. Samuel observed from the fence, his weathered face softening. "She'll come around, Miss Ellie." Eleanor nodded, not taking her eyes from the horse. "Some spirits aren't meant to be broken, Samuel." "Just understood." The filly took one hesitant step forward, nostrils flaring as she caught Eleanor's scent. Two survivors recognizing something in each other that others couldn't see. Wyoming Territory, 1885. Winter surrendered reluctantly that year, its icy fingers clinging to the shadows long after spring claimed the open plains. Eleanor Blackwood felt that lingering chill as she stood in her father's study, now hers, tracing the leather-bound ledgers with fingertips that knew both calluses and care. The numbers told a story of triumph against expectation. Blackwood Ranch, not only surviving, but thriving under a woman's hand. 2 years since Robert's death. 2 years of whispers behind her back, of proving herself daily to men who expected failure. 2 years of slowly reclaiming herself. "Miss Ellie." She turned to find Samuel, her foreman, hovering at the doorway. At 62, with a face weathered by 40 Wyoming winters, he still carried himself with the straight-back dignity of the former Buffalo soldier he was. "The midnight filly is giving young Thomas fits again," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Thought you might want to work your magic." Ellie closed the ledger, grateful for the interruption. "That filly just needs patience, not breaking." Outside, spring sunshine painted the ranch in shades of promise. Ellie breathed deeply, savoring the scent of new grass and damp earth. Blackwood Ranch spread before her, 3,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, 500 head of cattle, and the growing reputation for breeding the most sought-after horses outside of Kentucky. All hers now, all earned through sweat and tears and sleepless nights. The training corral stood a short distance from the main house. Inside, a young ranch hand circled warily around a midnight black filly whose eyes rolled white with fear. The horse's sides heaved with panicked breaths, hooves striking the dirt in agitated bursts. "Thomas," Ellie called softly, "step back now." The young man looked relieved to retreat to the fence. Ellie slipped between the rails, moving into the corral with slow, deliberate steps. The filly snorted, tossing her head at this new intruder. "I know," Ellie murmured. "Everyone wants something from you, don't they?" She stood motionless, letting the horse grow accustomed to her presence. Minutes passed. The filly's breathing gradually steadied. "Men think breaking is the answer," Ellie continued in that same quiet voice, taking one small step forward. "But you and I know different, don't we, girl? Some spirits aren't meant to be broken." Samuel watched from the fence, his expression thoughtful. "Reminds me of someone else I know," he commented when Ellie eventually joined him, the filly following at a careful distance. Ellie smiled but didn't answer. They both knew what he meant. They both remembered how she'd been after Robert, flinching at sudden movements, watching doorways, a wild thing trapped between fear and fury. "Miss Blackwood." Ellie turned to see a rider approaching, dust billowing behind him. James Turner, the bank messenger, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Hayes sent me to find you," he called, reining in his horse. "He said to tell you everything's approved, the loan for the new breeding barn, and that parcel of water-rich land adjoining your north boundary, all approved this morning." Relief washed through her. "Thank you, James. Please tell Mr. Hayes I'll come to town tomorrow to sign the papers." After the messenger departed, Samuel gave her a sideways glance. "That young banker has been mighty helpful these past months." "William Hayes is a businessman who recognizes a sound investment," Ellie replied, keeping her voice neutral, but she couldn't quite suppress the smile that tugged at her lips. William had been the first person in Silver Creek to treat her as something other than poor Mrs. Blackwood after Robert's death. The first to see the potential in her expansion plans rather than dismissing them as a widow's folly. And over months of business meetings that gradually evolved into shared meals and long conversations, he'd become something more. Tomorrow she would sign the loan papers that would secure Blackwood Ranch's future. And this evening she would dine with William at Silver Creek's finest restaurant, where he had promised a matter of personal importance to discuss. Ellie knew what that meant. At 27, with a successful ranch and 2 years of widowhood behind her, she was ready to hear his question. The dress rustled softly as Ellie smoothed the deep blue silk over her hips. It was the first fine garment she'd purchased since Robert's funeral, blacks ordered specially from Denver. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, hair arranged in fashionable waves rather than her usual practical braid, cheeks flushed with anticipation rather than windburn. A flash of memory intruded Robert, red-faced with drink, tearing a new dress she'd bought. "Playing the fancy woman now?" He'd snarled, fingers digging into her arms hard enough to leave marks, trying to catch men's eyes. Ellie closed her eyes, forcing the memory away. Robert was dead. His grip could no longer bruise her flesh. His words no longer wound her spirit. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, and tonight belonged to the future, not the past. William Hayes waited outside Silver Creek's Grand Hotel restaurant, handsome in a tailored suit, his normally serious face transformed by a smile when he caught sight of her. At 32, he had already established himself as the youngest bank manager in the territory, respected for his shrewd business sense and forward-thinking investments. "Eleanor," he said, taking her gloved hand, "you look absolutely breathtaking." The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversation of Silver Creek's upper society. Ellie felt curious glances sliding their way, the banker and the rancher widow, both defying expectations in their own ways. But William's steady presence beside her made those looks easier to bear. Over dinner, they spoke of the future, the railway coming within 20 miles of Silver Creek, the land values already climbing in anticipation, the opportunities for those positioned to take advantage. "Most can't see beyond today." William said, his eyes alight with the vision he described. "But the territory is changing. 10 years from now, this will be a different world." Ellie nodded. "That's why this expansion matters so much. With the additional water rights and new breeding stock, Blackwood Ranch will be established enough to weather whatever changes come." William reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "You think bigger than anyone I've ever known, Eleanor. Man or woman?" He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "That's one of the many reasons I've fallen in love with you." The moment stretched between them, delicate as spun glass. Ellie's heart quickened, not with fear, as it once might have, but with a tremulous hope. "I know this is unconventional," William continued, his voice low and earnest. "A banker courting a rancher. Your independence means everything to you, and I would never ask you to sacrifice your dreams or your identity." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "But I believe we could build something remarkable together. As partners, not as husband and master," Ellie finished softly. "Never that," he affirmed. "I've watched you rebuild Blackwood Ranch through sheer will and intelligence. I admire what you've created far too much to ever wish to control it." "Or you." Ellie studied him, this man who spoke of partnership rather than possession, who saw her ambition as an asset rather than a threat. After Robert, she had vowed never again to surrender her freedom or her safety to a man's authority. But William offered something different, a hand reaching out in support, not closing into a fist. "I'd like to court you properly, Eleanor," William said. "And if you'll allow it, I'd like to ask for your hand. Not tonight," he added quickly, seeing something flicker in her expression. "When you're ready, if you're ready." The relief she felt at this reprieve confirmed what she already knew. She cared for William deeply, but the shadows of her past still lingered. "I would welcome your courtship," she said finally. "The rest, let's allow time to answer." His smile was understanding, without a trace of the anger or resentment Robert would have shown at such a response. "Time is something I'm happy to give." As they walked back to where her buggy waited, William's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, a touch that asked nothing, demanded nothing. The evening air carried the scent of spring blossoms and possibility. "Will you be at the Founders' Day celebration next Saturday?" he asked. "I hadn't planned to." The spring foaling. "Consider it our first official outing," William urged gently. "The whole town will be there, including several Army officers interested in cavalry mounts. Good business," and his eyes crinkled warmly, "a chance for me to stand proudly beside the most impressive woman in the territory." Ellie felt a blush warm her cheeks, unaccustomed to such open admiration. "Then how could I refuse? On business grounds alone, of course." "Of course!" William agreed, his smile suggesting he understood all the words she hadn't said. He helped her into her buggy with courteous hands. As she gathered the reins, he stepped back, a proper gentleman, giving her the freedom to depart on her own terms. No demands, no possessive gestures, nothing like Robert at all. Good night, Eleanor, until tomorrow. Good night, William. Driving home beneath a canopy of stars, Ellie allowed herself to imagine a future different from the solitary path she'd resigned herself to after Robert's death. A partnership with a man who valued her strength rather than resenting it. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Would she ever fully trust again? Could she? The ranch house was dark when she arrived, the familiar silhouette, a reminder of all she'd accomplished alone. As she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror, still wearing the blue silk, still flushed from the evening's conversation. Playing the fancy woman now. Robert's voice ghosted through her memory, and Ellie shuddered, the joy of the evening momentarily tarnished. Even in death, he found ways to reach her, to make her question herself. No, she said aloud to the empty room, to the ghost that wasn't there. Not playing at anything. This is who I am now, who I choose to be. She slept fitfully that night, dreams shifting between William's warm smile and Robert's rage-contorted face, between hope and memory, between future and past. The Silver Creek Mercantile hummed with morning activity as Ellie examined fabric samples for new curtains. With William's courtship official, she found herself viewing the ranch house with fresh eyes, seeing the worn furnishings and faded textiles that had seemed perfectly adequate when she alone occupied the space. The blue linen would brighten up that south-facing parlor, suggested Mrs. Abernathy, the shopkeeper's wife, who had been unusually attentive since Ellie entered, especially for entertaining visitors. I'm not one for much entertaining, Ellie replied, though she found herself drawn to the fabric's cool shade. Mrs. Abernathy leaned closer. Well, that might change soon enough, from what I hear. Her eyes glittered with barely contained excitement. Mr. Hayes is quite the catch. My herald says he's being considered for the Territorial Banking Commission, youngest ever. Ellie smiled noncommittally. News traveled fast in Silver Creek. By sundown, her dinner with William would be common knowledge, embellished with whatever details imagination supplied. I'll take 5 yards of the blue, she decided, and those brass curtain rings. As Mrs. Abernathy measured the fabric, Ellie became aware of a sudden lull in the store's chatter. She turned to find Mrs. Hayes, William's mother, Victoria, entering the establishment, accompanied by her constant companion, Mrs. Sullivan. Both women were pillars of Silver Creek society, their approval or disapproval holding significant weight in the social calculations of the town. Eleanor, Victoria acknowledged with a precise nod. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, always impeccably dressed, her silver-streaked dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that Ellie suspected required a lady's maid to achieve. What a lovely surprise. There was nothing warm in the greeting, nothing to suggest she was pleased to encounter the woman her son had dined with the previous evening. Victoria Hayes had always treated Ellie with cool politeness, not openly disapproving, but certainly not welcoming. Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Sullivan. Ellie nodded to each woman in turn. I hope you're both well. Quite well, thank you. Victoria's gaze drifted to the fabric being measured, redecorating. How ambitious. The slight emphasis carried volumes of meaning. Eleanor Blackwood getting above herself, the rancher widow putting on airs. Just refreshing the parlor, Ellie replied evenly. Spring cleaning. Mrs. Sullivan fingered her jet necklace, mourning jewelry for a husband, 3 years deceased, though Ellie had heard whispers that her grief was more performative than genuine. We missed you at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting yesterday, Mrs. Blackwood, again. The ranch keeps me rather occupied, I'm afraid. Yes, well, the older woman sniffed. Some might say too occupied for proper feminine pursuits. But then, your situation is unusual. Ellie kept her expression neutral. Unusual but successful, Mrs. Sullivan. Blackwood Ranch has doubled its profits since I assumed management. Victoria Hayes raised an eyebrow. Indeed, William mentioned you've taken on considerable debt for expansions. Rather risky, wouldn't you say? The knowledge that William discussed her business affairs with his mother pricked uncomfortably. Calculated risks are the foundation of any successful enterprise, Mrs. Hayes. I'm sure your son would agree. William is a banker, my dear. He understands finance in ways a rancher might not fully grasp. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. but I'm sure he's explained the complexities to you." Before Ellie could respond, Mrs. Abernathy interjected, perhaps sensing the tension. "Will you ladies be attending Reverend Parker's lecture on virtuous womanhood this afternoon? I hear it's drawn quite a crowd from neighboring settlements." "Naturally," Victoria replied. "The Reverend is staying at our home, in fact. Such an eloquent speaker with most sensible views on a woman's proper sphere." Her gaze slid meaningfully to Ellie, who suddenly understood this encounter was no accident. Victoria Hayes wanted her to know exactly what she thought of her son's interest in a woman who lived well outside proper feminine pursuits. "How fortunate for the Reverend," Ellie said, accepting her wrapped package from Mrs. Abernathy. "Unfortunately, I have a meeting at the bank to sign loan papers for that risky expansion you mentioned. Good day, ladies." She departed with her head high, feeling their gazes boring into her back. Outside, Ellie took a deep breath of the spring air, steadying herself. Victoria Hayes' disapproval was hardly surprising. A self-made rancher widow would never be her first choice for her only son, especially one with political aspirations. It shouldn't matter. William was his own man, not a puppet dancing to his mother's strings. Yet the exchange had left a sour taste in Ellie's mouth, a nagging doubt about where she might fit in William's future. The bank stood at the corner of Silver Creek's main street, an imposing brick structure that projected stability and prosperity. Inside, Ellie was immediately shown to William's private office, a courtesy not extended to most clients and certainly not to most women. William rose as she entered, his face lighting with a smile that eased some of her disquiet from the mercantile encounter. "Eleanor, I was just reviewing the final papers." "I ran into your mother at the mercantile," Ellie said without preamble. A shadow crossed William's expression. "Ah, I hope she was civil." "She was exactly herself," Ellie replied, setting her package on a chair. "She seems concerned about my grasp of finance and my expanding debt." William sighed, running a hand through his light brown hair. "Mother has traditional views. She's of a generation that believes women should concern themselves with home and family, not business." "And what do you believe, William?" He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "I believe that you are the most capable ranch manager in the territory, regardless of gender. I believe that your expansion plans show remarkable foresight." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her wrists. "And I believe that my mother, for all her social influence, does not dictate my personal or professional decisions." The simple declaration soothed Ellie's concerns, at least partially. "She'll never approve of me." "She doesn't need to," William said firmly. "I'm not asking her to run the ranch with you. I'm not asking her to build a life with you." His eyes searched hers. "I'm asking you, Eleanor. Only you." The moment stretched between them waited with unspoken promises. Finally, Ellie nodded toward the desk. "Perhaps we should address the business at hand first." If William was disappointed by her redirection, he didn't show it. They spent the next hour reviewing the loan documents, his explanations clear and respectful, never patronizing. This was the William Hayes who had first earned her trust, the banker who treated her as a valued client rather than a perplexing anomaly. "That's the last signature," he said, finally blotting the ink. "Congratulations, Eleanor. Blackwood Ranch is now positioned for a very promising future." "Thank you for your faith in my vision." She meant it sincerely. Few bankers would have approved loans of this size to a woman widow or not. William smiled. "It's not faith when it's backed by solid planning and proven capability." He gathered the documents, placing them in a folder. "Now, about Saturday's Founders' Day celebration, I thought perhaps we could attend the afternoon activities and then dine at the Grand Hotel afterward." "That sounds lovely." Ellie rose, collecting her package. "Though I should warn you, I'm a poor dancing partner. 2 left feet, I'm afraid. I'm willing to risk crushed toes for the pleasure of your company." He escorted her to the door, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in what was becoming a familiar welcome gesture. "Until Saturday, then." "Until Saturday," she agreed, feeling a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the warmth in his eyes. Outside, Silver Creek bustled with midday activity. Ellie nodded to acquaintance as she made her way to where she'd tethered her horse. The animal nickered a greeting, nosing at her pocket for the apple she always carried. "Patience, Thunder," she murmured, stroking his sleek neck. "We'll be home soon." "Mrs. Blackwood." Ellie turned to find a woman she didn't recognize, approaching 40-ish, plainly, but neatly dressed with an earnest expression. "Yes." Forgive the intrusion. My name is Martha Collins. The woman twisted her hands nervously. I was hoping for a moment of your time. It's about, it's about your husband. Ellie stiffened. My husband passed away 2 years ago, Mrs. Collins. Yes, I know. Martha glanced around, lowering her voice. That's why I need to speak with you. I've traveled from Clearwater specifically to find you. A cold prickle of unease crawled up Ellie's spine. I'm afraid I don't understand. Not here, Martha insisted. Please. I'm staying at the boarding house on Pine Street. Could you call this evening? It's a matter of some delicacy. Before Ellie could respond, the woman pressed a folded note into her hand and hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. Bewildered, Ellie unfolded the paper to find an address scrawled in a neat hand with a time 7 o'clock. What could a stranger from Clearwater possibly have to say about Robert? And why the secrecy? Tucking the note into her pocket, Ellie mounted thunder and turned toward home. Her earlier buoyant mood replaced by a nagging disquiet that followed her all the way back to Blackwood Ranch. Dusk gathered as Ellie approached the small boarding house on Pine Street, a modest establishment that catered to traveling salesmen and visitors of limited means. She had debated whether to keep this strange appointment, but curiosity had ultimately won out. What possible connection could this Martha Collins have to Robert? The landlady directed her to a small room on the second floor. Martha opened the door at Ellie's knock, ushering her in with nervous glances down the hallway as though fearful of being observed. The room was sparse but tidy. A single bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs. A traveling trunk stood in one corner, but otherwise there was little evidence of the occupant's personality. Thank you for coming, Martha said, gesturing to one of the chairs. I wasn't sure you would. Ellie remained standing. You mentioned my husband. I'd like to know why. Martha sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. I should start at the beginning. I owned a small hotel in Clearwater, inherited from my parents. Widowed young like yourself. The business was profitable, well established. Her hands twisted in her lap. Then last year, rumors began circulating that I had improper relationships with male guests, that the hotel was not respectable. Ellie frowned. I don't see what this has to do with Robert. Please, Martha implored. Let me continue. The rumors destroyed my reputation. Customers stopped coming. The bank called in my loan. I was forced to sell at a fraction of the property's worth. Bitterness crept into her voice. To a company represented by the bank manager's brother-in-law. A cold feeling settled in Ellie's stomach. Mrs. Collins. 3 months later, Martha continued relentlessly. I discovered the hotel had been purchased because the railway was coming through Clearwater. The value tripled overnight. She leaned forward. And then I learned something else. The same pattern had happened before. In Red Rock. In Whispering Pines. Always a woman alone, and always rumors, was always property sold under duress just before its value increased. This is disturbing, Ellie acknowledged, but I still don't understand the connection to Robert. Martha reached for a leather satchel beside her chair, withdrawing several newspaper clippings and a stack of letters. I began investigating, following the money, and it led me to links between multiple banks in the territory and to the same silent investor behind many of the property acquisitions. She spread the papers on the table. Victoria Hayes. Ellie stared at this name, her mind refusing to make the connection Martha was suggesting. William's mother, the same. Martha touched one of the documents. She works through different banks, different representatives, but the pattern is clear. She identifies valuable properties owned by vulnerable women, arranges for rumors to destroy their standing in the community, then acquires the property through front companies. And Robert, Ellie's voice had grown cold-controlled. You still haven't explained his relevance. Martha hesitated. Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor, how much do you know about your husband's business affairs before his death? Robert handled his own investments, Ellie replied stiffly. She had learned early in their marriage not to question his financial decisions, not if she wanted to avoid his temper. He was one of Victoria Hayes's agents, Martha said quietly. He helped broker the Red Rock transaction, the one that drove a widow named Sarah Jenkins from her home. She pushed a letter forward. This is correspondence between them discussing the Jenkins situation and his commission for handling it. Ellie's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the letter. There was no mistaking Robert's bold handwriting, his distinctive signature. The contents made her stomach churn cold-blooded discussion of how best to pressure the widow into selling references to planting the necessary seeds of doubt about her character. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Martha's eyes were sympathetic but determined. "Because I believe you're the next target, Mrs. Blackwood. Your ranch occupies a critical position along the projected railway road. Victoria Hayes has been acquiring properties all along that corridor for the past 3 years." "No," Ellie shook her head. "William approved my loan. He's courting me. This makes no sense." "Perhaps he doesn't know his mother's methods," Martha suggested. "Or perhaps—" She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air between them. Ellie placed the letter back on the table, her movements deliberate, controlled. "You're suggesting William's interest in me is part of some elaborate scheme to acquire my land?" "I'm suggesting you be careful," Martha countered. "Watch for signs, strange rumors, sudden difficulties with suppliers or clients, unexpected loan complications." A cold dread settled over Ellie as she recalled Victoria's words at the mercantile. Her pointed references to Ellie's debt, her obvious disapproval. But William, surely not William. "I need to think," she said finally. "Do you have copies of these documents?" Martha nodded, gathering a smaller stack of papers. "These are for you. Names, dates, property, transactions. Enough to start your own investigation if you're inclined." Ellie accepted the papers, folding them carefully into her reticule. "Why come to me with this? Why not the authorities?" "The authorities," Martha's laugh was bitter. "The territorial judge was Victoria Hayes's brother's college roommate. The federal marshal owns shares in the railway. Who exactly should I approach?" She shook her head. "I came to you because I couldn't bear to see another woman destroyed as I was, as others were." The weight of what Martha had shared settled on Ellie's shoulders as she left the boarding house, the night air doing little to cool the flush of confusion and anger that heated her skin. Could it be true? Was she simply another target in Victoria Hayes's calculated campaign of acquisition? And William, had his intentions been genuine, or was he his mother's willing accomplice? She needed more information before confronting either Hayes. Needed to be certain. For now, she would watch and wait, keeping Martha's warning close. As she mounted Thunder for the ride home, the sound of approaching horses made her pause. A small group of riders passed beneath a street lamp, and Ellie recognized Victoria Hayes and Reverend Parker returning from some evening engagement. Their laughter carried on the night air, comfortable and conspiratorial. "The Blackwood Ranch will make a fine addition to our holdings," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. "William assures me the widow is amenable to persuasion." "And if she proves difficult?" the Reverend asked. Victoria's laugh held no mirth. "Everyone has secrets, Reverend. Everyone has vulnerabilities. We merely need to discover hers." The riders moved on, unaware of Ellie's presence in the shadows. She sat frozen, Martha's warnings confirmed in the most devastating way possible. William's courtship, his support of her expansion, his talk of partnership, all a calculated performance to lower her guard. Fury and betrayal warred within her as she rode toward home, the documents in her reticule seeming to burn against her side. She had been a fool, so eager to believe in a future with a man who respected her that she had ignored the warning signs. William Hayes was his mother's son, after all manipulative, deceptive, seeing her not as a partner, but as an obstacle to be maneuvered around. While Eleanor Blackwood had survived one ruthless man, she would survive another, and this time she would fight back. The Founders' Day celebration transformed Silver Creek's main square into a festive spectacle of bunting, banners, and booths displaying local crafts and produce. Ellie moved through the crowd with outward calm, nodding to acquaintances, pausing to admire a child's drawing or a homemaker's preserves. No one watching would guess the turmoil that had kept her awake through the night or the resolution she had reached by dawn. She would attend this celebration as planned, would smile and dance and play the part William expected. But she would be gathering information, watching interactions, observing who spoke with Victoria Hayes and how deferent they appeared. She needed to understand the full extent of the woman's influence before deciding how to proceed. "Eleanor." William approached, handsome in a formal suit, his smile apparently genuine as he took her gloved hand and pressed it warmly. "You look absolutely radiant." "Well, thank you," she replied, forcing a smile. "It's a lovely celebration, made lovelier by your presence." He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. Come, there are people I'd like you to meet. Colonel Richardson is here from Fort Laramie, specifically interested in your reputation for fine horses. As William guided her through the crowd, Ellie studied him with new awareness. Was there calculation behind his attentiveness? Could she have been so completely deceived by his manner? They paused at various groups, William smoothly introducing her to business contacts and territorial officials. In each case, he spoke proudly of Blackwood Ranch's reputation and Ellie's accomplishments as its manager, hardly the behavior of a man attempting to undermine her position. Yet she had heard Victoria's words with her own ears, had seen Robert's handwriting on those damning letters. Colonel Richardson proved to be a bluff, straightforward man with a genuine interest in quality horseflesh. Mrs. Blackwood, your Morgan thoroughbred crosses have been highly recommended. The cavalry is looking to establish a reliable local supplier for mounts. Blackwood Ranch would be honored to be considered, Colonel, Ellie replied, falling into the familiar rhythm of business discussion. Perhaps you could visit the ranch next week to view our stock. As they arranged details, Ellie became aware of Victoria Hayes watching from across the square, her expression impossible to read at this distance. The older woman stood with a group that included the territorial judge and what appeared to be railway officials based on their distinctive waistcoats and watch chains. Mother has been lobbying for the new courthouse to be built on the north side of town, William commented, following Ellie's gaze. Near our family home, coincidentally. His dry tone contained no reverence, no suggestion that he particularly supported his mother's efforts. Ellie studied his profile, confused by the apparent contradiction between the man beside her and the conspiracy Martha had outlined. Your mother seems to have many irons in the fire, she observed carefully. William sighed. Too many, some might say. She's never quite accepted that father's death left her with a comfortable independence rather than an empire to manage. She meddles in banking and politics and land development, all traditionally male spheres. The irony wasn't lost on Ellie. Rather like someone else you know. He turned to her, his expression softening. With one significant difference. You've built something genuine, Eleanor. Something of true value that benefits the community. Mother simply accumulates influence and property with no greater purpose than the accumulation itself. There was real criticism in his voice, real distance from Victoria's values. Either William was an exceptionally skilled actor, or Martha Collins's theory had a significant flaw. The celebration continued into the afternoon. Ellie found herself watching the interactions between mother and son whenever they were together, noting the stiffness in William's posture, the way Victoria dominated conversations, the subtle power struggle evident in their body language. Not the behavior of conspirators working in harmony, but of two strong-willed individuals with different agendas. As the sun began its descent, musicians assembled on a small bandstand, and couples moved to the cleared area before it. William turned to Ellie with a questioning smile. I warned you about my dancing, she reminded him. I've been practicing my defensive footwork, he replied, offering his hand. I'm willing to risk it if you are. The simple waltz brought them physically closer than propriety generally allowed, his hand resting properly at her waist, hers on his shoulder. Despite her inner turmoil, Ellie found herself responding to the music to the surprising grace with which William guided her through the steps. You're a natural, he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. I had a good teacher, she admitted. My father believed every young lady should know how to dance, even if she preferred horses to ballrooms. Tell me about him, William requested, guiding her through a turn. You rarely speak of your family. Ellie hesitated, then allowed herself to share a few precious memories, her father teaching her to ride to calculate breeding odds to negotiate a sale. He built Blackwood Ranch from nearly nothing, believed a person's word and work ethic mattered more than their background or their gender. He sounds remarkable. I wish I could have known him. The simple sincerity in William's voice made Ellie's chest tighten with confusion. This man whose touch was respectful and whose eyes held genuine interest in her words seemed incapable of the cold-blooded scheme Martha had described. Yet the evidence. Robert's letters, Victoria's overheard comments. As the music ended, William led her toward the refreshment tables. They were passing the courthouse steps when Ellie noticed a commotion near the sheriff's office. A crowd had gathered, voices raised in concern or curiosity. What's happening? She asked a nearby shopkeeper. Stranger in town, the man replied. Just rode in asking questions about land deals and banks. Sheriff's questioning him now. William frowned. Probably another railway speculator. They've been swarming the territory like locusts. Ellie stood on tiptoe trying to glimpse the stranger through the crowd. For a moment, the sea of people parted, and she caught sight of a man in trail-worn clothes, his face obscured, as he bent to speak with Sheriff Morgan. Something about his posture, the set of his shoulders, struck her as vaguely familiar. "Eleanor!" William's touch at her elbow recalled her attention. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, of course," she forced a smile. "Just curious." They continued to the refreshment table, but Ellie's thoughts remained with the mysterious stranger. A coincidence, surely a traveler arriving the same week Martha Collins had delivered her disturbing revelations. Yet Silver Creek was small enough that coincidences often proved to be anything but. William handed her a cup of lemonade. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he began, his expression growing serious. "Would you consider, William?" Victoria Hayes appeared beside them, her smile brittle. "And Mrs. Blackwood. How lovely to see you both enjoying the festivities." "Mother," William acknowledged stiffly, "I was just about to have a private conversation with Eleanor." Victoria's eyebrow arched. "I'm sure it can wait. Judge Parker was asking for you, something about the banking commission appointment." For a moment, William looked as though he might refuse. Then he sighed, turning to Ellie. "Would you excuse me? This won't take long." "Of course," Ellie replied, maintaining her pleasant expression. "Business should always come first." As William walked away, Victoria's demeanor shifted subtly, the social veneer thinning to reveal something harder beneath. "You've made quite an impression on my son, Mrs. Blackwood." "William and I share many interests, Ellie replied carefully. Indeed, Victoria sipped her own lemonade. "I would have thought your backgrounds too disparate for much common ground." "The future interests us both," Ellie said, "though perhaps our visions of it differ from yours." Something flashed in Victoria's eyes, surprised perhaps at the implied challenge. "The future belongs to those who prepare for it," Ms. Blackwood, those who position themselves advantageously. "By acquiring land along railway routes before the routes are publicly announced," Ellie asked quietly. "By spreading rumors to force vulnerable women to sell." All pretense vanished from Victoria's expression. "My, what an active imagination you have." "Not imagination, evidence." Ellie held the older woman's gaze steadily. "Robert kept records, Mrs. Hayes. Letters, documents." Victoria's composure slipped for just an instant, a flicker of calculation crossing her features before the social mask reasserted itself. "I have no idea what you're implying, but I suggest you consider your position carefully before making wild accusations, especially given your history." "My history. Your husband's death was tragic, of course. Such a terrible riding accident." Victoria's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Though some might wonder why an experienced horseman would be riding alone at night in such an inebriated state." Cold dread washed through Ellie. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Hayes?" "Threatening, no, my dear." Victoria's smile was a shark's all teeth in predatory intent. "Simply reminding you that we all have secrets, vulnerabilities. It would be a shame if your ranch suffered because of renewed questions." Mom, before Ellie could respond, William returned, his expression troubled. "Judge Parker's concerns could have waited," he said, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Mother, you said it was urgent." "Did I?" Victoria's performance was flawless, concern and confusion perfectly balanced. "Perhaps I misunderstood the judge. You know how my hearing troubles me in crowds." William's frown deepened, but before he could reply, a commotion near the sheriff's office drew everyone's attention. The crowd had grown, voices raised in excitement or alarm. "What now?" William muttered. A deputy pushed through the gathered townspeople, making directly for their small group. "Mrs. Hayes," he called, his expression grim. "Sheriff needs to see you right away. Says it's important." Victoria's confident expression faltered. "Can it wait? We're in the middle of a celebration." "No, ma'am." He was quite insistent. As Victoria reluctantly followed the deputy, William turned to Ellie with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry about all these interruptions. Perhaps we should continue our conversation over dinner as planned." Ellie was about to agree when she caught sight of the stranger from the sheriff's office, now moving through the crowd in their direction. Without the obscuring press of people, she could see him clearly, tall, broad-shouldered, with intelligent eyes set in a weathered face. Not a face she recognized, and yet, "Mrs. Blackwood," the stranger approached, touching his hat respectfully. "Mason Carter, I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Martha Collins. William stiffened beside her. Who are you, sir? As I said, Mason Carter. The man's gaze remained on Ellie. I've been investigating land fraud across the territory. Patterns of property acquisition through coercion, specifically targeting women property owners. He nodded toward the sheriff's office. I've just been sharing some of my findings with Sheriff Morgan, and now it seems with Mrs. Hayes as well. The implications hung in the air between them. William looked between Mason and Ellie, confusion evident in his expression. Eleanor, what is this about? I think, Ellie said quietly, that's what I'd like Mr. Carter to explain. Mason glanced around the crowded square. Not here. Too many interested parties. Sheriff Morgan has offered his office for a more private conversation. He looked directly at William. You might want to join us, Mr. Hayes. Some of what I have to share concerns your bank's operations. William's confusion had hardened into something colder, more wary. Are you making accusations, sir? I'm presenting evidence, Mason corrected. What you make of it is your business. Ellie studied William's face, searching for signs of guilt or complicity. She saw only growing anger and what appeared to be genuine bewilderment. Very well, William said stiffly. Let's hear this evidence. As they followed Mason toward the sheriff's office, Ellie felt as though she stood at a crossroads, one path leading toward the future she had begun to imagine with William, the other toward a truth that might destroy it. Ahead, Victoria Hayes had already entered the building, her rigid posture visible through the window. Mason paused at the door, his expression grave as he turned to Ellie. What I'm about to show you may be difficult to process, especially given your personal connections to some of those involved. I want the truth, Mr. Carter, Ellie replied firmly. No matter how difficult. He nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. Then let's proceed. Inside, Sheriff Morgan stood behind his desk, looking uncomfortable as Victoria Hayes alternated between imperious demands and barely veiled threats. She fell silent as they entered, her gaze locking with Ellie's in a moment of perfect mutual understanding. Battle lines had been drawn. Mason placed a leather satchel on the sheriff's desk, its contents spilling out in a cascade of documents, letters, and newspaper clippings. Mrs. Blackwood, he said gravely, I believe you already know some of what I'm about to share, but there's more, much more. He withdrew a tattered journal, its leather cover scarred and worn. This belonged to your late husband, Robert Blackwood. I found it among the personal effects of a man named James Ferguson who died in Denver 3 months ago. Ferguson was Victoria Hayes's former business associate. Mason opened the journal to a marked page, his expression somber. What I'm about to show you will change everything you thought you knew about your husband's death. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ellie stepped forward to read the damning words written in her dead husband's hand. The sheriff's office had fallen silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of paper as Mason Carter organized his evidence on the desk. Ellie stared at Robert's journal, her fingers hovering above the familiar handwriting without quite touching the page, as if the words might burn her. April 15th, 1883. Hayes wants the Crawford widow's land. Says railways coming through that section. Offered 15% if I can convince her to sell. Woman stubborn, but everyone has a weakness. Hayes suggests rumors about her and the ranch hand might soften her position. April 20th, 1883. Crawford place secured. Cost me a bloody lip, but the widow broke eventually. Always do when you find the right pressure point. Hayes pleased. Nausea rose in Ellie's throat as she read. Entry after entry chronicled Robert's work for Victoria Hayes, locating vulnerable women with valuable property, applying whatever pressure necessary to force them to sell, collecting his commission when they broke. And then the final entries. March 2nd, 1883. Hayes has new target. Biggest yet. Says railway junction location makes it worth 10 times previous acquisitions. Wants it secured before summer. March 10th, 1883. Met with Hayes. Target is Blackwood Ranch. My own damn property. Says Eleanor would be easier to manipulate than me once I'm gone. Offering 30% to stage my death, disappear, let her handle the widow as usual. Tempting but countered for 40%. Waiting for response. Ellie's vision blurred, the words swimming before her eyes. He was planning to fake his death, she whispered. To let Victoria target me as another widow to be pressured into selling. William had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the journal with horrified fascination. This can't be real. Mother would never. Oh, but she would, William. Victoria interrupted, her voice cold and controlled despite the growing evidence against her. Business is business. The weak make way for the strong. It's the natural order. Mason pulled another document from his satchel. Robert agreed to the plan, signed a contract with Victoria for 40% of Blackwood Ranch's eventual sale price once the railroad acquisition was complete. He slid the paper across the desk. But something went wrong. The accident, Ellie murmured. No accident, Mason corrected gently. Robert Blackwood's death was neither accident nor staged disappearance. It was murder. The word hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Sheriff Morgan shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving instinctively toward his holstered pistol as the tension in the room escalated. That's absurd, Victoria snapped. Robert Blackwood died in a riding accident. The doctor confirmed it. Dr. Morris confirmed a broken neck from a fall, Mason agreed. But he never examined Robert's drink for the laudanum that was added to it. Never questioned why an experienced rider would attempt a treacherous trail in the dark while heavily drugged. Ellie gripped the edge of the desk, her knees threatening to buckle. How do you know this? Mason's expression softened slightly. Because the man who killed Robert kept a journal too. He withdrew a small battered notebook. James Ferguson, Victoria's enforcer, the man who carried out the dirty work she couldn't be publicly associated with. He recorded everything insurance against the day Victoria might decide he too was expendable. William had begun to pace his movements, agitated. This is madness. Mother, tell them this is all fabricated. Tell them. Victoria's composure remained intact, though a muscle twitched in her jaw. These documents proved nothing. The word of a dead criminal against a respected member of society. Please. Ferguson's word, Robert's journal, financial records showing property transfers, and testimony from 3 women you forced out of their homes. Mason's voice was implacable. The federal marshal is on his way from Cheyenne with warrants. It's over, Mrs. Hayes. For the first time, real fear flickered across Victoria's face. She turned to William, her voice softening to a plea. William, darling, you can't believe this nonsense. Everything I've done has been for you, for our family's position. William stopped pacing, his expression hardening as he looked at his mother. Really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. Did you arrange Robert Blackwood's murder? Victoria's hesitation was answer enough. My God. William's voice broke. How many people have you? Only those who became liabilities, Victoria replied, her tone disturbingly matter-of-fact. Business requires difficult decisions, William. I've taught you that since childhood. Ellie felt bile rise in her throat at the casual admission. And what about me? Was I just another widow to be manipulated? Another property to acquire? She looked at William, unable to keep the betrayal from her voice. Was that your role, to court me, gain my trust, make me vulnerable? No. William stepped toward her, his expression anguished. Eleanor, I swear to you I knew nothing of this. My feelings for you are genuine. He's telling the truth, Mrs. Blackwood, Mason interjected quietly. William Hayes has been kept largely in the dark about his mother's methods. He manages legitimate banking business, makes the official loans and transfers, while Victoria handles the auxiliary arrangements. Victoria made a dismissive sound. William knows how the world works, how fortunes are built. He may not have known the details, but he's benefited from every acquisition, every strategic move. I never wanted any part of this, William insisted, looking between his mother and Ellie with growing horror. Yes, I've suspected Mother's business dealings weren't always above board, but murder terrorizing women, I never. His voice faltered. Sheriff Morgan cleared his throat. I think I'd better place Mrs. Hayes under house arrest until the federal marshal arrives. Carter, you'll surrender those documents as evidence. As the sheriff moved toward Victoria, she straightened her spine, every inch the society matron even in disgrace. This isn't over, she told Mason coldly. Influence doesn't disappear with one setback. Perhaps not, he agreed. But it does tend to evaporate when former associates realize they might hang alongside you. The territorial judge was most disturbed to learn of his unwitting involvement in your schemes. Victoria's composure finally cracked, her eyes blazing with fury as Sheriff Morgan escorted her from the office. The room felt emptier without her commanding presence, yet somehow easier to breathe in. Ellie sank into a chair, the full weight of the revelations pressing down upon her. Robert had planned to abandon her, to let her become Victoria's next victim. But someone, this James Ferguson, had murdered him instead. And William, had he truly been ignorant of it all? I know this is overwhelming, Mason said gently, taking the chair across from her. But there's more you need to understand. William remained standing, his posture rigid with tension. What more could there possibly be? Mason studied him for a moment and then turned back to Ellie. Ferguson's journal entries suggest Robert was abusive toward you, that there were incidents. Heat flooded Ellie's face. The shame she had thought long buried rose to the surface, threatening to choke her. That's private, she managed. It has nothing to do with this. It might, Mason replied carefully. Ferguson wrote that he'd witnessed Robert striking you several weeks before the murder, that it wasn't the first time. He claimed that was part of his motivation for killing Robert, rather than simply helping him disappear as planned. William made a strangled sound. Eleanor, is this true? Did Robert? Stop. Ellie's voice was sharp, her control threatening to fracture. Just stop. I don't want to discuss this. Not here, not now. A weighted silence fell. Mason finally broke it, his tone gentler than before. There's one more thing you should know, Mrs. Blackwood, about Ferguson. What about him? Ellie asked wearily. He was my brother-in-law. Ellie's head snapped up, meeting Mason's steady gaze. What? My sister Margaret was one of Victoria's early victims, a widow with valuable land near the first railway spur. Ferguson was Victoria's enforcer then, too. He spread the rumors that destroyed Margaret's reputation, forced her to sell, drove her from her home. Mason's voice had grown rough with suppressed emotion. She took her own life 6 months later. He drew a slow breath, composing himself. Ferguson couldn't live with what he'd done. Started drinking heavily. That's when Victoria recruited him fully into her operation. A broken man was easier to control, to threaten if he got cold feet. But my sister's death haunted him. When he saw what Robert was doing to you with Victoria's encouragement, Mason shrugged. Something snapped, I suppose. Ellie struggled to absorb this new information, to connect this stranger to Robert's death, to her own unexpected freedom from a marriage that had become a prison. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve the truth, Mason replied simply, and because Ferguson left something else for you. He withdrew a sealed envelope from his satchel, his confession and his apology. He wanted you to know why he did what he did. Ellie stared at the envelope, her name written across it in an unfamiliar hand. So many secrets, so many shadows emerging into harsh light. She slipped the envelope into her pocket without opening it. Some truths could wait. William had moved to the window, staring out at the Founders' Day celebrations, still in progress, though the sun was now sinking toward the horizon. All those business trips Mother took, he said quietly. All those investment opportunities she pursued on behalf of the family, I never questioned, never looked too closely. He turned back to face them, his expression haunted. What kind of son doesn't see his mother for what she is? The kind who trusts, Ellie replied, surprising herself with the lack of condemnation in her voice. The kind who believes in family. Mason gathered his documents, replacing them carefully in his satchel. The federal marshal will have questions for both of you. Mrs. Blackwood as Robert's widow, Mr. Hayes as the bank manager who processed many of these transactions, however unwittingly. I'll cooperate fully, William said. Whatever it takes to make this right. Ellie rose suddenly, desperate for air, for space to think. I need to return to the ranch. Samuel will be worried if I'm not back by nightfall. I'll escort you, Mason offered. There may be others involved in Victoria's operations who won't be pleased about these developments. William stepped forward. Eleanor, please. We need to talk. About us. About what happens now. The plaintive note in his voice stirred something in Ellie, not the affection she had felt growing over recent months, but a kind of pity. William Hayes stood amid the wreckage of his family's reputation, his business integrity compromised, his understanding of his own past fundamentally altered. All because he had chosen not to see what was before him. There is no us, William, she said gently. There can't be. Not now. Pain flashed across his features. Because of my mother, Eleanor, I swear I didn't know. I believe you, she interrupted. But it doesn't matter. Every time I look at you, I'll see her. I'll wonder what else you chose not to know, what other secrets might be revealed. Ellie shook her head. I've lived that life already with Robert. Always walking on eggshells, always wondering what might trigger the next explosion. I won't do it again. I'm nothing like Robert, William protested. I would never hurt you. Ellie thought of the journal entries of Robert's calculated plan to abandon her to Victoria's tender mercies. There are many ways to hurt someone, William. Dishonesty can wound as deeply as fists. His shoulders slumped in defeat. At least let me make this right. The expansion loan, the water rights, those are legitimate. I'll make sure they're secured, unassailable, no matter what happens with the bank after all this. Thank you, Ellie said simply. That would be appreciated. As she and Mason left the sheriff's office, the celebration continued unabated in the town square, the participants blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded within that small room. Music still played, children still laughed, couples still danced. Life went on untouched by the shattering of Ellie's carefully reconstructed world. Your horse, Mason asked quietly. At the livery stable, but I'm in no hurry to return home yet. Ellie needed time to process, to absorb the revelations that had upended her understanding of the past 2 years. There's a small park behind the church. It's usually quite empty. Mason nodded, falling into step beside her without further comment. His presence was oddly comforting, solid, undemanding. He made no attempt to fill the silence with platitudes or questions, simply allowing her the space to think as they walked away from the square, away from the music and laughter that now seemed to belong to another world entirely. The park was indeed deserted, the late afternoon shadows stretching long across its simple benches and modest flower beds. Ellie sat heavily, the weight of the day's revelations pressing down upon her shoulders. He was going to abandon me, she said finally, the words escaping like birds long caged. Let me think he was dead, then watch from a distance as Victoria destroyed me. Mason sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. Ferguson's journal suggests Robert was having second thoughts toward the end. That's partly why Victoria authorized the murder. She feared he might back out of their arrangement. Because he cared for me, Ellie laughed bitterly. No, Robert saw me as proper, same as the ranch. He wouldn't abandon something that belonged to him. More likely, he realized Victoria would cheat him of his percentage. You know that for certain. Ellie's hand moved unconsciously to her ribs, where the worst of Robert's beatings had left a permanent reminder, a slight deformity, in one rib that ached in cold weather. I know Robert Blackwood better than anyone, she said quietly. I lived with his rages, his jealousy, his absolute conviction that I was his to do with as he pleased. Yet you stayed. The simple observation held no judgment, but Ellie felt defensive nonetheless. You don't understand. Robert was different when we married. Charming. Attentive. By the time I saw the truth, we were already in Wyoming, far from my family, from anyone who might have helped, and he made it very clear what would happen if I tried to leave. Mason nodded. Ferguson mentioned threats in his journal. Said Robert boasted that he'd caught you packing once and that you'd never try to leave again. Hot shame washed through Ellie at the memory. He broke 3 of my fingers. Told me if I ever tried to run, he'd do worse. Her voice had dropped to a whisper. I believed him. Of course you did, Mason replied. You had every reason to. The simple validation, free from the pity or disbelief she had feared, loosened something tight in Ellie's chest. For 2 years, she had kept the truth of her marriage locked away, crafting the public image of the grieving widow while privately rejoicing in her liberation. To finally speak of it, to be believed without question, felt like setting down a burden long carried. After he died, she continued, I was sure someone would realize the truth. That his drinking, his injuries, the late-night ride, none of it made sense. But Dr. Morris signed the death certificate without question, and everyone was so focused on the poor widow that no one looked closer. Ellie shook her head. I've spent 2 years waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to point the finger at me. And now you learn it wasn't an accident at all, but murder, Mason said quietly. That must be disorienting. Disorienting, Ellie repeated, a hollow laugh escaping her. That's one word for it. I've built a new life, Mr. Carter. Expanded the ranch, established a reputation as a fair dealer and a good employer. I was even considering marriage again, believing I had finally put the past behind me. She gestured helplessly. And now this. Robert's crimes, Victoria's schemes, murder and frame-ups, and God knows what else. How do I move forward from here? The same way you moved forward after Robert's death, Mason suggested. One day at a time, building something honest and worthwhile. While Ellie studied him, this stranger who had blown apart her carefully reconstructed life, yet who spoke with such quiet confidence about rebuilding. You make it sound simple. Not simple, just necessary. He met her gaze directly. The alternative is letting Victoria Hayes win, letting her destroy another woman's life and livelihood even from behind bars. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Mason looked away, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. After my sister died, I was lost, angry, determined to find who was responsible and make them pay. His mouth twisted in a wry smile. I was a teacher before that, literature at a small college in Pennsylvania. Had never considered any other life. Ellie tried to imagine this weathered, capable man standing before a classroom of students discussing poetry or prose. It was surprisingly easy to visualize. There was an educated precision to his speech, a thoughtfulness in his observations. What changed, she asked. I followed the money, Mason replied simply. Learned to track paper trails, to recognize patterns, to build cases that would stand up in court. Joined the Pinkertons for a while to gain experience. Then went independent when I realized how deeply Victoria's influence ran within official channels. He looked back at her. It became my purpose, and to stop her from destroying more lives. And now, Ellie gestured toward the sheriff's office where Victoria's carefully constructed empire was beginning to crumble. You've achieved your purpose. What's next for Mason Carter? He considered the question, his expression thoughtful. I'm not sure, he admitted finally. I've been focused on this pursuit for so long, haven't given much thought to what comes after. They sat in companionable silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the small park in shades of gold and amber. Around them, Silver Creek prepared for the evening festivities, lanterns being lit in the square, the sound of laughter and music carrying on the cooling air. I should return to the ranch, Ellie said eventually. There will be questions, concerns. Samuel and the others, they've stood by me through everything. They deserve to hear the truth from me, not as gossip. Mason nodded, rising to offer her his hand. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it, allowing him to help her to her feet. His grip was firm but gentle, releasing her the moment she was steady. The federal marshal will likely arrive tomorrow, he said as they walked toward the livery stable. You should prepare yourself for more questioning, more revelations. Will you be there? Ellie wasn't sure why it mattered. Why the thought of this stranger's presence during the ordeal ahead should provide comfort, but it did. If you wish it. No presumption in the simple statement, just an offer of support that she was free to accept or decline. I do, she said quietly. I think I'd feel safer with someone who already knows the whole truth, someone who believes me. The livery stable's warm, hay-scented interior enveloped them as they entered. Ellie's gelding Thunder nickered a greeting from his stall, familiar and reassuring in a world suddenly gone sideways. I'll saddle him, Mason offered. If that's all right. Ellie nodded, watching as he moved with quiet efficiency, his hands sure on the horse's flank, his movements calm and deliberate. Thunder, usually wary of strangers, accepted Mason's ministrations without protest, a good judge of character in his equine way. You're good with horses, Ellie observed. Grew up on a small farm in Ohio, Mason replied, glancing over his shoulder with a slight smile. Nothing grand like Blackwood Ranch, but enough horses and cattle to learn the basics. He tightened the cinch with practiced ease. Haven't had much occasion for riding these past few years. Miss it sometimes. Another piece of the puzzle that was Mason Carter slotted into place. The farmer's son, turned teacher, turned investigator, a man shaped by loss and purpose rather than ambition. Thank you, Ellie said as he led Thunder into the stable yard. Not just for this, but for everything. For uncovering the truth. For bringing Victoria Hayes to justice. Mason handed her the reins, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Blackwood. There's still much to be resolved. But I promise you this, I won't leave until you're safe, your ranch secure, and Victoria's accomplices identified. It wasn't until Ellie was halfway home, the gelding's steady gait eating up the miles between town and ranch, that she realized Mason had made no mention of his own plans, his own future beyond the immediate resolution of Victoria's case, as if his path were now somehow linked with hers, at least for the foreseeable future. The thought was both unsettling and oddly comforting. The ranch house lamps burned late that night as Ellie shared the day's revelations with Samuel and her most trusted hands. Their expressions ranged from shock to outrage to grim vindication. Always knew that woman was trouble, Samuel growled, his weathered hands clenched into fists on the kitchen table. Way she looked at our land, last cattle auction, like she was already measuring it for fancy furnishings. Icky, young Thomas, barely 20 but already showing the makings of a fine horseman, shook his head in wonder. And Mr. Hayes really didn't know what his ma was up to. Hard to believe, Miss Ellie. I think he chose not to know, Ellie replied, remembering William's stricken expression in the sheriff's office. Saw what he wanted to see, ignored what didn't fit his image of his mother. Like how folks in town ignored what kind of man Mr. Robert really was, observed Maria, the Mexican woman who had kept house for Blackwood Ranch since before Ellie's arrival. Her dark eyes held understanding, born of her own hardships as a widow in a territory that valued women mainly as wives and mothers. Ellie nodded, grateful for the tacit acknowledgement. She had never spoken directly of Robert's abuse, but Maria had tended her injuries more than once, had seen the bruises and the fear. Had kept her silence, understanding all too well the precarious position of a woman with nowhere to run. "What happens now, boss?" asked Caleb, the youngest of her ranch hands, but already showing a shrewd mind for business alongside his skill with horses. "Bank loan still good." "William assured me it was," Ellie replied, "but with his mother's arrest, the bank's reputation." She shrugged. "We prepare for difficulties. Delay the expansion plans, focus on the contracts we already have. Build our cash reserves." Samuel nodded his approval. "Sensible. Been meaning to tell you that Army colonel who came by last month sent word he wants 20 mounts by fall, offering top dollar too." Ellie felt a small surge of hope at this news. The Army contract alone would keep the ranch solvent through winter regardless of what happened with the bank loan. "And what about this Mason Carter?" Maria asked, her tone suggesting she'd been waiting for the right moment to pose the question. "He's staying in town long." "Until the federal marshal completes his investigation, and at least," Ellie replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the knowing look in Maria's eyes. "Mr. Carter has been tracking Victoria Hayes's operations for years. His evidence will be crucial." Samuel studied her over his coffee cup. "Seems like a decent sort for a lawman." "He's not exactly a lawman," Ellie corrected. "More of a private investigator." "Well, mighty convenient, him showing up just when you needed someone on your side." Maria observed her expression, innocently bland despite the implication in her words. Ellie felt heat rising to her cheeks. "It wasn't like that. He's been investigating Victoria Hayes since his sister died. It's not about me." "If you say so, Miss Ellie," Maria replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth as she rose to clear the table. "But a man doesn't ride halfway across the territory just for justice, not unless there's something more personal at stake." After the others had retired, Ellie remained at the kitchen table, the sealed envelope Mason had given her lying before her like a challenge. Ferguson's confession, his explanation for murdering Robert. Part of her wanted to burn it unread to let the past remain buried, but a larger part needed to know to understand. With hands that trembled only slightly, she broke the seal. "Mrs. Blackwood, by the time you read this, I will be beyond earthly justice. The consumption has nearly finished its work, and I go to meet my Maker with the weight of many sins upon my soul. What follows is my confession regarding the death of your husband, Robert Blackwood, on the night of April 18th, 1883. I was employed by Victoria Hayes to assist in acquiring properties along the planned railway route. My role involved creating circumstances that would pressure property owners to sell at disadvantageous prices. In plain language, I was her bully and her thief. Your husband was also in Mrs. Hayes's employ, tasked with similar work. He personally arranged the destruction of 3 widows' reputations and livelihoods, taking a percentage of the profits when their properties were acquired below value. In March of 1883, Mrs. Hayes identified Blackwood Ranch as essential to her plans for the railway junction. She proposed that Robert fake his death and disappear, allowing you to be targeted as his widow. Robert agreed to this plan for 40% of the eventual sale price. I was assigned to assist with the staged accident and to help pressure you into selling once Robert was dead. However, on April 10th, 1883, I witnessed Robert strike you repeatedly in your own home when you questioned his late return. It was not the first such incident I had observed. This awakened memories of my late wife's sister, Margaret Carter, who suffered similar abuse before taking her life after losing her home and reputation to Mrs. Hayes's schemes. I had assisted in Margaret's destruction, a sin for which I expect eternal damnation. I could not be party to such evil again. On the night of April 18th, I added laudanum to Robert's whiskey at the Silver Creek Saloon, knowing his route home crossed Blackwood Ridge. In his drugged state, he fell from his horse at the ridge's steepest point, breaking his neck instantly. I did not intend mercy in this act. I wished him to suffer as those he had harmed had suffered. That his death was quick is proof that God's justice exceeds my own. I have lived these past 2 years with the weight of my crime. Yet I cannot claim regret for Robert's death, only for my part in causing such suffering to others, before I found whatever fragment of conscience remains in my corrupted soul. You need fear no accusation from beyond the grave. I leave separate testimony with the federal authorities confirming that you had no knowledge of or participation in your husband's death. This confession is for you alone to do with as you will. May you find peace in the life that circumstance and my sin have granted you. James Ferguson. Ellie read the confession twice, her emotions too tangled to name. Relief that her darkest fears that someone might suspect her involvement in Robert's death were laid to rest. Horror at the cold-blooded calculation behind both Victoria's and Robert's actions. And most disturbing of all, a sense of gratitude toward a murderer who had, however, unwittingly granted her freedom. She folded the letter carefully and carried it to the fireplace. There was no need for this confession to ever become public. No need for Ferguson's crime to enter the official record beyond whatever testimony Mason had already provided to the authorities. With a steady hand, she fed the pages to the flames, watching as they blackened and curled the past, turning to ash before her eyes. The federal marshal arrived the following day, a grim-faced man named Howard Jennings, who wore his authority with the ease of long practice. He established his temporary headquarters in the Silver Creek Courthouse, summoning witnesses and collecting evidence with methodical precision. Mason met Ellie at the entrance. When her turn for questioning came, his presence a bulwark against the curious stares and whispered comments that followed her through town. Marshal Jennings is tough, but fair, he assured her as they climbed the courthouse steps. Just tell him exactly what you told me. Except about Ferguson's letter, Ellie murmured, mindful of listeners. Mason's expression revealed nothing, but he gave a slight nod of understanding. Except that there's no need to complicate the case against Victoria with details that can't be proven now that Ferguson is gone. The marshal's interrogation was indeed thorough, but not unkind. He seemed particularly interested in Ellie's interactions with Victoria Hayes, both before and after Robert's death. And you never suspected Mrs. Hayes was involved in property fraud? He asked, watching her face carefully. Never, Ellie replied truthfully. I knew Robert had done some work for her, but I assumed it was legitimate business. He didn't discuss his affairs with me. Yet Mrs. Hayes continued to take an interest in Blackwood Ranch after your husband's death, Jennings pressed. That didn't strike you as unusual? Ellie considered her answer carefully. I assumed she was being neighborly in her fashion. And once William began courting me, her interest seemed, well, like a potential mother-in-law assessing her son's choice. The marshal made a note, his expression giving nothing away. And William Hayes himself, did he ever pressure you regarding the ranch? Suggest selling or taking on a partner? Never, Ellie stated firmly. William was supportive of my expansion plans. He approved the loans that other banks had refused. If anything, he encouraged me to think bigger, to position the ranch for future growth. Jennings sat back, studying her thoughtfully. Mrs. Blackwood, I've interviewed a dozen witnesses today. Most folks in Silver Creek seem to hold you in high regard. They describe you as honest, hardworking, fair in your dealings. He paused. But there have been suggestions that your marriage to Robert Blackwood was not harmonious, that there were incidents. Heat rose to Ellie's face. She had known this might come up, but the direct question still caught her off guard. My marriage is not relevant to Victoria Hayes's crimes, she said stiffly. Perhaps not, the marshal acknowledged, but given the circumstances of your husband's death and his connection to Hayes, I need to understand the full picture. Ellie glanced at Mason, seated quietly in the corner of the room. His expression remained neutral, but she caught the slight nod encouragement to speak her truth, however difficult. Robert had a temper, she said finally, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat, especially when he drank. And he drank often. This temper, Jennings prompted gently. Did it turn violent? Ellie stared at her hands folded tightly in her lap. Yes. Did you ever consider leaving him, seeking help from family or authorities? A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Marshall, we both know what happens to women who try to leave their husbands. The law offers little protection and even less when you're hundreds of miles from family or friends. She raised her eyes to meet his directly. I considered it once. Robert made sure I understood the consequences of such a choice. Something like understanding flickered in the marshal's gaze. I see. He made another note. Mrs. Blackwood, I need to ask this directly. Did you have any involvement in your husband's death? Any knowledge of plans to harm him? No, Ellie replied, her voice steady. I had no knowledge of any plan or conspiracy regarding Robert's death. I believed it was an accident until yesterday when Mr. Carter revealed Ferguson's confession. Jennings nodded, apparently satisfied. Thank you for your candor. That will be all for now, though I may have additional questions as the investigation progresses. Outside the courthouse, Ellie took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling unexpectedly lightened by having spoken aloud truths long hidden. Mason fell into step beside her as they descended the steps, his presence unobtrusive yet steadying. You did well in there, he said quietly. It was easier than I expected, Ellie admitted. To finally acknowledge what Robert was, to stop protecting his memory. Mason nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. Marshal Jennings interviewed William Hayes this morning. Seems the bank's records confirm his story. He handled legitimate transactions, while Victoria managed her shadow operations through proxies. Will he face charges? Ellie wasn't sure why she cared why William's fate should matter to her after the collapse of whatever had been growing between them. Unlikely unless new evidence emerges. Willful blindness isn't a crime, though it should be. Mason's tone held a hint of contempt. He'll face professional consequences, of course. The banking commission won't look kindly on such lax oversight. They walked in silence for a moment, the bustle of Silver Creek's main street flowing around them. The town seemed subdued today, the news of Victoria Hayes' arrest, and the shocking revelations behind it casting a pall over the usual activities. What happens now? Ellie asked finally. Victoria will stand trial along with several associates identified in Ferguson's records. The properties acquired through her schemes will likely be subject to legal challenges from the original owners. Mason glanced at her. Including those women who lost their homes and livelihoods. Ellie thought of Martha Collins forced to sell her hotel for a fraction of its worth, of Margaret Carter driven to suicide by shame and loss, of all the others whose lives Victoria had casually destroyed in her pursuit of wealth and power. Good, she said firmly. They deserve justice compensation. They had reached the corner where their paths would diverge. Ellie toward the livery stable to collect Thunder Mason back to the hotel where he was staying during the investigation. Will you be at the ranch tomorrow? She asked, surprising herself with the question. The marshal mentioned he might have more questions, and She trailed off, uncertain how to express her desire for his continued support without appearing weak or dependent. I'll be there, Mason assured her. Early afternoon, if that suits. Relief flooded through her, though she kept her expression composed. That would be fine. Samuel makes a decent coffee if you're inclined. The hint of a smile warmed Mason's usually serious expression. I'm always inclined toward decent coffee, Mrs. Blackwood. Until tomorrow, then. And Ellie watched him go, his tall figure moving purposefully through the crowd. A strange man, this Mason Carter, with his quiet strength and unswerving purpose. A man who had upended her world, yet somehow made her feel more secure in it than she had since Robert's death. The ride back to Blackwood Ranch gave her time to process the events of the past 2 days, to begin adjusting to the new reality they created. By the time the familiar roofline appeared on the horizon, Ellie had made several decisions about how to proceed. Samuel met her in the yard, taking Thunder's reins with a questioning look. Everything all right with the marshal, Miss Ellie? As well as can be expected, she replied, stretching to ease the stiffness in her back. He may have more questions in the coming days. The foreman nodded, his expression troubled. Town's full of talk. Bank's closed today, some kind of emergency meeting of the directors. And they say Mrs. Hayes is being moved to Cheyenne to await trial. Good riddance, Ellie said with feeling. Samuel, I need to make some changes. Contingency plans in case the bank loan falls through with all this upheaval. Already ahead of you, boss. Samuel's weathered face creased in a smile. Been thinking we should reach out to that Denver buyer who was interested in our yearlings last fall. Offer him first pick of this spring's crop at a slight discount for immediate payment. Would bring in enough cash to cover expenses through winter, loan or no loan. That's exactly what I was thinking. Ellie agreed, gratitude welling within her for this loyal man who had stood beside her through every challenge. Draft the offer letter tonight. I'll sign it first thing tomorrow. Will do. Samuel hesitated, then added, that investigator fellow going to be around much longer. Carter, he'll be here tomorrow afternoon. The marshal has more questions. Ellie kept her tone neutral. Why do you ask? Samuel shrugged, his expression deliberately casual. No reason, just noticed he seems to know his way around horses. Might be useful to have another experienced hand around with spring training in full swing. Ellie raised an eyebrow, not fooled by the innocent suggestion. I'm sure Mr. Carter has other commitments once the Hayes investigation concludes. If you say so, Miss Ellie. Samuel led Thunder toward the stables, but not before she caught the knowing smile he tried to hide. Ellie shook her head, torn between exasperation and affection. Her ranch hands were worse than gossiping church ladies when it came to her personal affairs. But their concern came from genuine care, from the family-like bonds that had formed among the small group that kept Blackwood Ranch running. Entering the house, Ellie found Maria in the kitchen kneading bread dough with vigorous movements that suggested she was working out some strong emotion. The housekeeper looked up at Ellie's entrance, her dark eyes sharp with concern. Town sheriff came by while you were gone, she announced without preamble, asking more questions about Mr. Robert's death, about where you were that night, who saw you. Ellie froze, her heart suddenly pounding. What did you tell him? Maria snorted, slapping the dough with particular force. Told him you were here with me mending curtains until past midnight. Same as I told him 2 years ago when it happened. She fixed Ellie with a penetrating stare. Is true. No, you were here in this house. Yes, Ellie confirmed quietly. I was here, alone in my room after dinner. Robert went into bed and never came back. The housekeeper nodded, satisfied. So I told truth. You were here. What you were doing is not sheriff's business. She returned to her kneading, adding conversationally. They are saying Mrs. Hayes arranged for Mr. Robert to be killed, that a man named Ferguson did the deed. Ellie moved to the sink, washing her hands to give herself a moment to compose her response. That appears to be the case, according to the evidence Mr. Carter has uncovered. Maria studied her employer's back. And how do you feel about this, Miss Ellie, to learn your husband was murdered, not killed in accident? It was a direct question, more direct than anyone else had dared to ask. But then Maria had been there, had seen the bruises, heard the late-night arguments, witnessed Robert's escalating control and cruelty. I feel, Ellie turned, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. I feel as though justice was served, even if not by legal means. And I feel no grief, no desire for vengeance against the man who killed him. Only relief. Still, after all this time. Maria nodded slowly, no judgment in her expression. Is natural. When my first husband died in the mines, I lit a candle in church and thanked the Virgin Mary for my deliverance. Father Ignacio would have been shocked if he knew. She smiled slightly. Some men make better ghosts than husbands know. The simple understanding freely offered without need for elaborate explanation brought the sting of tears to Ellie's eyes. Yes, she agreed softly, some do. This Carter man, Maria continued, deftly changing the subject as she shaped the dough into loaves. He is coming tomorrow. For the marshal's questions? Yes. I will make the good coffee then, and perhaps the apple cake. Maria's tone was innocent, but her eyes held a mischievous glint. A man who brings justice deserves proper hospitality. Ellie recognized the futility of protest. The coffee will be appreciated, I'm sure. Later, as twilight settled over the ranch, Ellie stood on the porch watching the first stars appear. The familiar landscape stretched before her, rolling pastures, the silhouettes of horses against the darkening sky, the distant line of mountains that marked the boundary of her land. All of it hers secure now from Victoria Hayes's machinations. Yet the events of the past 2 days had changed something fundamental in how she viewed her life, her future. The protective wall she had built around herself after Robert's death, the careful isolation she had maintained, they no longer seemed necessary or desirable. Victoria's schemes had forced Ellie to recognize that connection could be a source of strength, not just vulnerability. Martha Collins had risked reaching out to a stranger, sharing her story in hopes of preventing another woman's destruction. Mason Carter had dedicated years to seeking justice for his sister and others like her. Even William, for all his willful blindness, had genuinely cared for her, had seen her as a partner rather than a possession. Perhaps it was time to truly emerge from the shadows of her past. Not just to survive, as she had been doing these past 2 years, but to live fully openly. To build connections based on truth rather than the careful facade of the respectable widow she had presented to the world. As darkness claimed the land, Ellie made another decision. Tomorrow, when Mason Carter came to the ranch, she would show him not just the successful businesswoman, but the person beneath with all her scars, her fears, her hopes. Would offer not just coffee, but truth. It was time to step into the light. Mason Carter arrived at Blackwood Ranch shortly after noon, riding a rented bay gelding that seemed eager to stretch its legs after the journey from town. Ellie watched his approach from the corral where she had been working with the midnight filly, now named Shadow for her color and elusive temperament. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mason greeted her, dismounting with easy grace. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." Ellie slipped through the corral rails, brushing dust from her riding skirt. "Shadow and I were just getting acquainted. She's finally decided I might be worth listening to." Mason studied the filly with an appreciative eye. "Beautiful animal. Morgan bloodlines. Morgan thoroughbred cross. She'll make an excellent cavalry mount once she learns some manners." Ellie nodded toward the house. "Maria has coffee waiting as promised, and apple cake, which I highly recommend." They walked side by side toward the ranch house, Mason matching his stride to hers without apparent thought. In the daylight on her own territory, Ellie found herself noticing details about him she had missed during their previous encounters. The touch of silver at his temples, despite his relatively young age, the faint scar that traced his jawline, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. "Marshal Jennings sent me ahead to let you know he'll be arriving within the hour," Mason explained as they reached the porch. "He has additional questions about Victoria's activities following your husband's death." "I suspected as much." Ellie led the way inside, noting how Mason removed his hat and automatically wiped his boots before entering, the instinctive courtesy of a man raised with respect for a home's threshold. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the scent of Maria's baking. The housekeeper herself was conspicuously absent, though she had left coffee cake and place settings arranged on the table with pointed domesticity. "Maria appears to have urgent business elsewhere," Ellie observed dryly as she poured coffee into the waiting cups. Mason accepted his with a grateful nod. Marshal Jennings tends to have that effect on people. They suddenly remember appointments across town when they hear he's coming. "Are his questions likely to be difficult?" Ellie asked, seating herself across from him. "Not for you," Mason assured her. "He's building the case methodically, establishing Victoria's pattern of operation. Your testimony helps connect Robert's activities to her larger scheme." He sampled the cake appreciation, lighting his features. "This is exceptional." "Maria's specialty," Ellie acknowledged, "though I suspect today's effort received special attention." On at Mason's questioning look, she added, "The household has taken an interest in your visits. They seem to find you intriguing." A hint of color touched Mason's tan cheeks. "I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Blackwood." "Eleanor," she corrected impulsively. "After everything that's happened, I think we're beyond formalities, Mr. Carter." "Mason, then," he agreed, his expression warming. "And your household's interest is understandable given the circumstances. I imagine strangers who aren't buyers or sellers are rare at Blackwood Ranch, particularly strangers who upend everything I thought I knew about my husband's death." Ellie replied more sharply than she had intended. Mason set down his coffee cup, his expression growing serious. "I understand this has been disruptive. If there was a gentler way to reveal the truth, I would have chosen it." "No," Ellie shook her head. I didn't mean it as criticism. The truth needed to come out, however painful." She met his gaze directly. "I'm grateful, Mason, for your persistence, your thoroughness, for bringing Victoria Hayes to justice before she could harm anyone else." Relief softened his features. "I wish I could have done so earlier, before she targeted you and Blackwood Ranch." "Before she targeted me, perhaps," Ellie conceded. "But not before she sent Ferguson after Robert. That's one death I can't bring myself to regret, God forgive me." The admission hung between them raw and honest. Mason studied her face for a long moment before replying. "When my sister died," he said quietly, "I was consumed with guilt. I had been away teaching, too busy with my career to notice her suffering. By the time I realized what Victoria's scheme had done to her, it was too late." His hands tightened around his coffee cup. For years afterward, I fantasized about finding Victoria Hayes and making her pay personally for Margaret's death. About taking justice into my own hands when the law failed. What stopped you? Ellie asked softly. I realized that becoming what I hated wouldn't bring Margaret back, wouldn't honor who she was. Mason's gaze was distant, seeing ghosts. My sister was gentle, kind. She would have been horrified to see me become a murderer in her name. You chose justice over vengeance, Ellie observed. I tried. Mason refocused on her, his expression clearing. So I understand not grieving Robert's death, Eleanor, and I don't judge you for it. Some men earn the consequences they receive, whether through the law or otherwise. His simple acceptance of her truth, offered without the judgment or horror she had feared, loosened something tight in Ellie's chest. This man understood what few others could, the complicated relief of being freed from an abuser, the absence of conventional grief, the guilt that came with such feelings despite their naturalness. I've never spoken of it, she admitted, of what Robert was really like, what our marriage truly was. Not to anyone except Maria, and even then only in fragments. It's not an easy thing to share, Mason acknowledged, especially in a small community where appearances matter so much. I was afraid, Ellie continued, the words coming more easily now. First of Robert, then of people's judgment if they knew the truth. The respectable widow was easier to portray than the abused wife, who felt only relief at her husband's death. She gave a small, bitter laugh. And now I learned that Victoria Hayes knew all along. That Ferguson witnessed Robert's violence and chose to act because of it. Victoria knew because it served her purposes, Mason reminded her gently. She collected information about everyone who might be useful or pose a threat to her schemes. It wasn't personal knowledge, just data. Ellie nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. Victoria's awareness of her situation hadn't been born of concern or empathy, merely calculated advantage. After the marshal's questioning is complete, she asked, what happens next for you, I mean? Mason seemed taken aback by the direct inquiry. I'm not entirely sure, he admitted. I've been pursuing Victoria Hayes for so long, I haven't given much thought to what comes after. He hesitated, then added, there are other cases like hers, other powerful people exploiting the vulnerable for profit. The techniques I've developed tracking Victoria could be applied elsewhere. So you'll move on to another investigation, Ellie concluded, trying to ignore the inexplicable disappointment that accompanied the realization. Perhaps. Mason studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, though I find myself reluctant to leave Silver Creek just yet. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Before Ellie could formulate a response, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they could see Marshal Jennings and a deputy riding into the yard. It seems our time for coffee is over, Ellie observed, rising to greet the newcomers. Mason stood as well, touching her arm lightly to pause her movement toward the door. Eleanor, he said, his voice low and earnest, whatever you choose to share with the marshal, know that your truth is safe with me. All of it. The simple promise meant more than elaborate declarations might have. Ellie covered his hand with her own, a brief touch of acknowledgement before she stepped away to meet the law's representatives with composure regained and walls carefully rebuilt. Some truths were not for marshals or deputies. Some were shared only in quiet kitchens over coffee and apple cake with those rare souls who could hear without judgment. Marshal Jennings's additional questions proved straightforward, focused primarily on establishing the timeline of Victoria's interactions with Blackwood Ranch following Robert's death. Ellie answered truthfully but selectively, omitting Ferguson's personal letter, while confirming the broader facts of his confession as Mason had presented them. Mrs. Hayes seems to have been particularly interested in your property after your husband died, the marshal observed, reviewing his notes, made several approaches through her son and other intermediaries. The ranch has a strategic location, Ellie explained, good water access, proximity to the planned railway. Its value would increase significantly once the railway plans became public. Jennings nodded. According to the documents we've seized, Mrs. Hayes had plans for a major development at the Junction Hotel's warehouses, stockyards, all requiring the land Blackwood Ranch currently occupies. Plans that will not come to fruition, Mason added from his position by the window where he had been silent throughout most of the questioning. Indeed not, the marshal agreed. Mrs. Hayes will stand trial in Cheyenne for conspiracy fraud and as an accessory to murder. Given the evidence against her, I expect she'll spend the remainder of her days in prison. He closed his notebook with finality. Mrs. Blackwood, I believe that concludes our business for now. Should additional questions arise, I'll send word. Thank you, Marshal, Ellie replied, rising to see him out. I appreciate your thoroughness in this matter. Once the lawman had departed, Mason turned to Ellie with a relieved smile. That went well? Jennings is satisfied with your account, and the case against Victoria grows stronger by the day. What about William? Ellie asked. Will he testify against his mother? He's cooperating fully, Mason confirmed. Whether from genuine remorse or self-preservation remains to be seen. But his testimony further isolates Victoria, confirms that she was the driving force behind the entire operation. Ellie moved to the window, watching the marshal and his deputy grow smaller as they rode toward town. It's strange, she mused. For 2 years, I've lived with the fear that someone might discover the truth about my marriage, about my feelings regarding Robert's death. Now that it's all coming to light, I feel lighter, as if a burden has been set down. The truth often has that effect, Mason observed, coming to stand beside her. Even painful truths are easier to bear in the open than in shadow. They stood in companionable silence, watching the spring sunlight play across the ranch yard. In the corral, Shadow trotted with increasing confidence, her movements showing the natural grace that would eventually make her a prize mount. Would you like to see the rest of the ranch? Ellie offered suddenly. Since you're here and the marshal's business is concluded. Mason's smile was answer enough. I'd like that very much. They spent the afternoon on horseback, Ellie proudly showing Mason the scope of Blackwood Ranch's operations, the breeding paddocks, where mares nursed new foals, the cattle pastures stretching toward distant hills, the crystal-clear stream that provided essential water rights for the entire property. You've built something remarkable here, Mason observed, as they paused to rest the horses atop a small rise overlooking the valley. With or without the expansion plans? It's not just me, Ellie demurred. Samuel has been with the ranch since my father-in-law's time. He knows this land, these animals better than anyone. And the others, they've all contributed their skills, their loyalty. But it's your vision guiding them, Mason insisted. Your determination that's turned Blackwood Ranch into one of the most respected horse breeding operations in the territory. He studied her profile against the backdrop of her domain. You should be proud, Eleanor. The simple validation offered without qualification or patronizing surprise at a woman's achievement warmed her more than excessive praise might have. I am, she admitted, though it hasn't been without cost. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they turned back toward the ranch house. The day's revelations and shared confidences had created a new ease between them, a comfortable silence that required no filling with unnecessary words. At the stable, Mason insisted on unsaddling both horses himself, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone raised around such tasks. Ellie watched him, struck by how naturally he fit into the ranch's rhythms, how at ease he seemed in surroundings so different from the courthouses and sheriff's offices where she had previously encountered him. Will you stay for dinner? She asked as they walked toward the house. Maria always makes enough to feed an army, and you've earned a proper meal after answering all my questions today. Mason hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd be honored. Though I should warn you, your household's interest in my visits is likely to intensify if I start accepting dinner invitations. Let them speculate, Ellie replied with unexpected lightness. After 2 years of carefully guarded reputation, a little gossip seems a small price for pleasant company. Dinner proved to be exactly that, pleasant, relaxed, filled with conversation that ranged far beyond the investigation that had brought them together. Mason spoke of his teaching days, of the literature he had loved to share with his students. Ellie described her father, his belief in her abilities, even in an era when daughters were rarely trusted with business matters. He sounds like a remarkable man, Mason observed, as Maria cleared away the dishes, pointedly refusing his offer of assistance. Ellie agreed, a wistful smile touching her lips. He would have despised Robert had he lived to see whom I married, would have seen through the charm to the cruelty beneath. How did you meet Robert? Mason asked, seemingly genuinely curious rather than merely polite. Ellie considered the question, realizing she rarely spoke of that time in her life. I was 19, just finished with school back east. Robert was 30, handsome, confident, everything a sheltered girl finds irresistible. He was in Denver on business attending the same social events as my family. She shook her head at the memory of her younger self. I mistook his possessiveness for devotion, his control for protection. By the time I understood the difference, we were married and moving to Wyoming, far from anyone who might have helped me see the truth sooner. You couldn't have known, Mason said gently. Men like Robert and are skilled at presenting the face their victims most want to see. Perhaps, Ellie ran her finger along the rim of her water glass, lost in memory. But I ignored warning signs. A comment here, a controlling gesture there. Even my father expressed concern, though he tried to frame it as worry about the distance rather than the man himself. She looked up, meeting Mason's understanding gaze. I was so determined to prove my independence, my adulthood, that I refused to consider I might be making a terrible mistake. We all have regrets, Mason offered. Choices we would unmake if given the chance. Do you, Ellie asked. Have regrets, I mean. He was quiet for a moment, considering. I regret not recognizing my sister's distress sooner, not returning home when her letters grew increasingly distraught. His expression darkened with remembered pain. I was building my academic career, focused on my own path. By the time I realized something was truly wrong, Victoria's scheme had already destroyed Margaret's reputation, her livelihood, her sense of self. You couldn't have prevented it, Ellie said, echoing his earlier reassurance to her. Victoria Hayes has been manipulating people and systems for decades. One man alone couldn't have stopped her then. Perhaps not, Mason acknowledged, but I might have saved my sister even if not her property or standing. Might have convinced her that she still had value beyond what others thought of her. He shook his head. Instead, I arrived to find her already in the ground, and Victoria's scheme proceeding exactly as planned. The raw grief in his voice touched something deep within Ellie, the recognition of a wound that never fully healed, a loss that shaped everything that came after. Without conscious thought, she reached across the table to cover his hand with her own. So you reinvented yourself, she said softly. Became someone who could stop Victoria from harming others as she had harmed Margaret. It wasn't a noble decision at first, Mason admitted. Vengeance drove me more than justice. But over time, as I tracked Victoria's operations, as I met her victims and heard their stories, he turned his hand beneath Ellie's, their fingers intertwining naturally. I began to see that stopping her was more important than punishing her, that protecting others from her schemes mattered more than my personal vendetta. The simple touch of their joined hands felt more intimate than any embrace might have. Two people shaped by loss and betrayal, finding unexpected connection in the sharing of their truths. And now, Ellie asked, suddenly aware of the deepening twilight outside of the lamplight, casting a warm glow over their linked hands. With Victoria awaiting trial, her schemes exposed what purpose will drive Mason Carter. He studied their joined hands, his expression thoughtful. I've been asking myself the same question since arriving in Silver Creek. For so long, pursuing Victoria has defined my days, my decisions, my entire life. His gaze lifted to meet hers. I think perhaps it's time to build something new, something based not on what I'm against, but what I'm for. And what are you for, Mason Carter? Ellie's voice had dropped to little more than a whisper, the question heavy with meaning beyond its simple words. Truth, he replied without hesitation. Justice, the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. His thumb traced a gentle circle on the back of her hand. And perhaps, if I'm fortunate, a partnership with someone who values those same things. The implication hung in the air between them, clear, yet still tentative enough to provide retreat if needed. Ellie felt her heart quicken, both in response to the gentle touch and to the possibility his words suggested. Partnership is a serious proposition, she said carefully, not to be entered lightly, especially when both parties have histories. Indeed, Mason agreed, it requires trust, honesty, a shared vision. His gaze remained steady on hers, and time to develop naturally without pressure or haste. The acknowledgement of their respective wounds, of the care needed to navigate them, reassured Ellie more than ardent declarations might have. This was a man who understood patience, who recognized that trust must be earned rather than demanded. Time, she echoed. That seems wise. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken possibility. Then, with gentle reluctance, Mason withdrew his hand and rose from the table. It's growing late, he observed. I should return to town before full dark. Ellie stood as well, suddenly aware of the propriety questions their extended dinner might raise if Mason remained much longer. Of course, though you're welcome to stay in the guest room if you prefer not to ride back tonight. Another time, perhaps, he declined with a smile that softened the refusal. Marshal Jennings has early meetings tomorrow, and I should be available for consultation. She walked him to the porch where his horse waited, already saddled by one of the ranch hands. The spring night was mild, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Thank you for dinner, Mason said, donning his hat, and for the tour of your remarkable ranch. Thank you for your honesty, Ellie replied. For sharing your story as I shared mine. He mounted smoothly, gathering the reins. I'll call again if that would be welcome. It would, she assured him, a smile coming naturally to her lips. Very welcome indeed. As Mason rode away, Ellie remained on the porch, watching until his figure disappeared into the gathering darkness. Inside, she could hear Maria moving about, humming a cheerful tune that suggested the housekeeper had observed enough of the evening's interactions to satisfy her matchmaking instincts. For the first time since Robert's death, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, Ellie felt the stirring of genuine possibility. Not merely survival or independence, but something richer, deeper. A partnership based not on dominance and submission, but on mutual respect and shared values. It was far too soon to name such feelings, too soon to make plans or commitments. But it was not too soon to recognize their potential to nurture the delicate seedling of connection that had taken root amid the upheaval of Victoria's exposure. Time, Mason had said, time to develop naturally without pressure or haste. Time was something Eleanor Blackwood finally had in abundance, time to heal, to build, to explore this unexpected path that had opened before her. One day at a time, as Mason had suggested when she asked how to move forward. One day at a time, with hope rather than fear guiding her steps.